Hello, Classical Conversations. It's Mrs. E with Cycle 2, Week 19, Composers and Orchestra. We are starting our fourth unit of Fine Arts, and today we're going to introduce the time period of our Cycle 2 composers. Now, we are doing our Classical and Romantic period. Last year we discussed the Baroque and Classical, and in the coming cycle we'll do Romantic and Modern. Have you heard those words before? In our timeline, they are set in the same tune. So you'll hear Baroque period of the arts, and then you'll hear Classical period, and then you'll hear Romantic period, and then you'll hear Modern period. And that is the time in our timeline where music has changed and literature, even architecture, and our artists. So as you saw from our artists in Cycle 2, they looked a lot different than our artists in Cycle 1. Well, music changed too. I just looked up the Classical period, and it was about 75 years. So their music would change a lot between them and going into the Romantic period. 75 years ago would be when my grandma was a little girl. 75 years ago, she was listening to Bing Crosby on the radio and the Glenn Miller Band and Peggy Lee, musicians you probably haven't heard of, but maybe your parents do. These would be your great-grandparents. And now we're listening to completely different music, but we do appreciate what my grandma listened to, and it is interesting, and it's still really beautiful and pretty, and some of us might not like it. But because of that music, it changed how we think of music, and it helped us develop our own style. When you look at the classical music, you're going to see, or the classical period music, you're going to see that what was going on in the world changed how they thought of it too. Our art was different. Our architecture at the time was, they were trying to make it look more Greek and very organized and very symmetrical. But you'll see in the Romantic period, art was changing, architecture was changing, even countries were changing. So their music was very different. Now that's a lot of blurred lines I'm throwing at you. So let's talk about what was going on during the Classical period of the arts. I'm going to use my textbook that CC recommends called Classical Music for Dummies. Here it is. And I'm just going to go through some highlights. So we have a timeline for our different eras of music, and you'll see that the Classical period is put probably around 1730, and it really sets off with Handel's Messiah. That's something you hear a lot at Christmas time, the Hallelujah chorus, very beautiful, but that also is considered Baroque period. You'll hear Mozart's opera, Don Giovanni. This is the time where the American Revolution began. That's when our country began. You'll see Haydn's 94th Symphony. He's very famous for his water music. Napoleon will crown himself Emperor of France. Remember, that's how we sing it in the timeline song. And Beethoven is going to compose his symphonies. All 9 are considered perfect and classical, and he's considered the genius of the classical era. I keep calling it an era, the classical period. And Beethoven is going to take us from the classical into the Romantic period. So in the Romantic period, we will see Wagner, the American Civil War, Tchaikovsky, that's Nutcracker, another one you hear at Christmas time. And the Romantic period is also when a lot of countries, like we mentioned America, a lot of countries are forming in Europe. And they're getting their borders, and they're figuring out if they're going to have monarchies and how they're going to be organized. So you're also going to hear a lot of traditional songs for those countries. So you'll hear very Russian sounds from Russia, and a very folky Czech song coming from Czechoslovakia. These countries are going to start developing their own taste. We'll learn more about that as we go. So that is our timeline. And if I didn't mention it, that was page 185 and our foundation guide. Now, let's talk a little bit more without mixing them up. We'll talk completely about classical, and then we'll talk completely about romantic, and then I'm going to play just a couple tidbits of music for you. You're only going to hear the beginning. I'm not going to tell you who it is, and I will send links to everybody to listen fully to it and give you instructions. So the classical period. My favorite book for this time of year is this one. CC does not recommend this. This is Mrs. E's personal quarantine supplies. And this is the story of the orchestra. I think they're even selling it at Costco right now if you make a quarantine run. This book comes with a CD, which is a little bit dated, but you can get everything on Spotify and YouTube, and Amazon Music is where I found a lot a couple years ago. And it goes through our composers and our classical music eras. So the classical music era in classical music. The classical era is from 1770s, maybe a little earlier, to roughly the 1830s. In the Baroque period, which was right before it, we saw really complicated music that was full of quick notes and speedy scales, and remember, it was very, very choppy. And the musicians at that time, if they didn't write it, it was really hard for them to give it to someone and have them play it. It was very, very difficult and very, very fancy. As the classical era, which is the one we're discussing now, got underway, composers started writing music that was simpler to play. It was intended to be beautiful and for shopkeepers and school teachers to hear it, not just kings and queens. They concentrated on music technique and music theory. This, after all, was the period in which men like Benjamin Franklin were discovering electricity and founding the United States. And the music heard from the orchestras reflected what would become known as the Age of Reason. In the Age of Reason, not only had the music changed, but the audience who heard it changed too. By the late 1700s, orchestra music was no longer just for royal courts and churches, which was our Baroque period, but common people began to attend concerts. And this meant that composers like Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven were able to work for rich people who wanted to patronize the arts. When you patronize the arts, that means you pay people to write music for you. You can patronize an artist to paint something beautiful for you. Just like the patronizing nobility and the church had done during the Baroque era. Okay, so that is our classical era in music. Now I'm going to skip ahead because I'm not allowed to tell you about the composers this week. And we're going to talk about the Romantic era. This is the classical music era with more pizzazz and oomph, if that makes sense. Orchestra music had been through a lot during the time of the Romantic era, or by the time of the Romantic era. It had been ornate and full of notes in the Baroque period. Remember, fancy and choppy, and then simpler and more thoughtful in the classical era. And now composers in the Romantic era welcome lessons from both of them. Now this could sound familiar. If you listen to music, your parents might say, that sounds like music I used to listen to, or we heard this 20 years ago. It's because we borrow from each other. Now, they took the good lessons from both the Baroque and the classical period and kind of mixed them together. And they took it in a totally new direction, filling it with passion and drama. They used music to overwhelm their listeners with emotion. They would write sad, sweeping pieces about love and heartbreak and magical fantasies. We'll get into it in the coming weeks, but they would have operas with goblins and witches and beautiful swans. The orchestra was also influenced by the Romantic period. For example, composers and conductors would make different seating arrangements for their orchestra, and we'll see our composer standing in the middle. These changes were more or less kept. We still see them in modern orchestras. Okay, moving on. We are going to listen to a little bit of three composers. So the first one is one of the most popular musicians ever. If you know nothing about classical music, you know who this guy is. And his first few notes are some of the most popular in any song ever. Maybe you can think of that. What if I said, dun dun? Could you finish it? Dun dun dun, dun, right? So let's give it a listen. And I'm going to get out of the frame for a moment.